The Aramaic Peshitta Old Testament, brought to you by JesusSpokeAramaic.com. What is the Aramaic Peshitta Old Testament? The Aramaic Peshitta Old Testament, also called the Peshitta Tanakh or Aramaic Old Testament, is an early translation of the Tanakh or Hebrew Bible into Syriac. Syriac is an Eastern dialect of Aramaic, the same Aramaic dialect that the Aramaic New Testament or Peshitta is written in. As we saw in our video lessons on the Aramaic Targums, the Targums are the official Jewish translations of the books of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic, which have, at least partly, become authoritative in Judaism. The Targums were not translated in one go, at one point in time, by one person or a single group of people. Instead, different translations or Targums arose over time according to need. Targum Onkelos, for example, is the official Targum of the Law, or Torah. By contrast, the Peshitta Tanakh, or Aramaic Old Testament, has a completely different, independent history. Almost certainly, the Peshitta Tanakh was translated early on, that is, several centuries before Christ, probably in or around Babylon, hence the Syriac or Eastern dialect of Aramaic in which it is written, or while the Jews were still scattered across the Babylonian Empire. The Peshitta Tanakh is an accurate, consistent, and coherent translation, meaning that it is a translation of the books of the Hebrew Bible as a whole at one point in time by one translator or a single group of translators, whereas the Targums were translated over time according to need by different people. It is likely that the Targums and the Peshitta Tanakh influenced each other, since both were translated into Aramaic at approximately the same time. But whereas the Aramaic Targums became approved or adopted by mainstream Judaism, the Aramaic Peshitta Old Testament, by contrast, seems to have become adopted by the early Jewish converts, Christian believers, and in fact was subsequently ignored and rejected by mainstream Judaism. There are a number of factors why this may have been the case. 1. As mainstream Judaism and early Christianity both went their separate ways, there may have been a deliberate intention not to accept the translation of the other, or to differentiate between the translations of the two opposing camps. 2. The Targums vary in quality and the intention behind the translation, with some being interpretive in nature. By contrast, the Aramaic Peshitta Old Testament is a simple, literal, direct translation with no interpretation. The Midrashic translation of the Targums appealed to mainstream Judaism and later to rabbinical Judaism. 3. In being an independent translation, the Peshitta Tanakh is perhaps more favorable to the belief that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah, in that passages which are traditionally understood as messianic passages remain unchanged, whereas mainstream Judaism in the Targums was more free to change the translation in messianic passages. 4. The earliest Christian believers were located in Turkey and Syria, where the Aramaic Estrangela script was used. This is a script which the Peshitta New Testament soon adopted. Likewise, the Peshitta Old Testament adopted the Estrangela script, for instance in Codex Ambrosianus. As the Estrangela script looked visibly different from the normal Hebrew Ashuri characters, it provided a further reason for the Peshitta Tanakh and the Aramaic Targums to go their separate ways, with the Targums being favoured by Jews and the Peshitta Tanakh being favoured by the early Jewish Christian believers. The highly recommended book, The Text of the Old Testament by Ernest Worthwain, contains a great deal of interesting and useful information on the manuscripts and traditions that make up the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. It contains individual chapters on the history and manuscript tradition of the Aramaic Targums, as well as that of the Peshitta Tanakh. Like us, it concludes that the Peshitta Tanakh has early Jewish origins, that the Targums and the Peshitta Tanakh are likely to have influenced each other, and that the early Jewish believers, Christians, adopted the Peshitta Tanakh as their favourite translation of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic. The Aramaic Peshitta Old Testament, then, is a single, coherent translation done at approximately the same time as the Aramaic Targums. Peshitta is the Aramaic word meaning straight or simple, like the Hebrew word pashut, meaning that the Aramaic Old Testament or Peshitta Tanakh is a straightforward, fairly literal translation of the Hebrew Tanakh. In other words, and in contrast to some of the Targums, it is not a paraphrase, nor an embellishment, nor a pesher, an explanation, nor midrash, homiletic interpretation of the Hebrew Tanakh. This makes the Peshitta Tanakh an early and very valuable witness of the Hebrew Bible. It is an accurate, honest, and reliable translation that can and should be consulted whenever questions arise about the Hebrew Old Testament text. Furthermore, because both the Aramaic Old Testament and the Aramaic New Testament, Peshitta, are both in the Syriac Eastern dialect of Aramaic, and because both are used by churches of the East today, they are often grouped together. They are sometimes bound in a single volume, known as the Peshitta Bible or Biblia Peshitta. The Lamsa Bible, for example, is a translation of the Peshitta Bible, Old and New Testaments. As well as being an important work in its own right, the Peshitta Tanakh is an important alternative to the Aramaic Targums. In fact, comparing the Aramaic Targums and the Aramaic Peshitta Old Testament is often a fascinating exercise, with the differences always of interest. Be sure to watch the other lessons in this series on the Peshitta Tanakh to find out more about this Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Scriptures.